So now, our next speaker is Dr. Hoyt Edge, who is the Hugh F. and Jeanette G. McCain Professor of Philosophy and the Associate Dean of the Faculty at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. Over the past decade, his research has focused on the island of Bali, Indonesia, working with the Balinese psychiatrist Lou Kututsoyani. I don't know how I'm doing, Hoyt, you'll correct me. From a philosophical perspective, he has researched concepts of self, contrasting it to the traditional Western notions, as well as to the Australian Aboriginal conceptions. With Suryani, he created and administered the Balinese Volitional Competency Questionnaire. Over the last 6 years, Edge and Suryani have continued their work in Bali by conducting studies on direct mental influence over living systems. He will be speaking to us, appropriately, mediumship in the Balinese context. Dr. Edge.
I must myself be a medium because I've had some automatism last night that is supposed to be thanks to the Bial Foundation and not the Bali Foundation, who have supported my research over the last 6 to 8 years, but certainly my thanks go out to the Coleys and the Parapsychology Foundation for their support and a very early invitation, which supplied a lot of motivation for me to continue in this field. You know, when you look at the papers in this conference, they're sort of divided into two ways, in the two forms. There's the traditional evidential research. People are interested in finding out what information mediums can give, whether or not it's veridical, what implications it has, and so forth. We've had several examples here. When I began the research over 30 years ago, if we had had that kind of conference, almost all of the papers would have been this kind of paper. What's interesting is that when you look at the papers today in this conference, there is a much wider range of papers. There are other approaches, anthropological, psychological, linguistic, and so forth. And in a sense, and I'm going to contribute, it's hard to place a category on mine, but I want to contribute to that, and essentially my bottom line is going to be that if we look at mediumship at Bali, even though the first traditional question is important, we don't really understand Balinese mediumship unless we take other approaches to it also. It seems to me cross-cultural studies are important in parapsychology. You know, virtually every culture in the history of the world that we know of have reported some sort of psychic phenomena. There have been very few cross-cultural studies of parapsychology, of parapsychological phenomena, and those Bob Van der Kessel certainly did important work with Sunglass Islands. The Roses did important work among the Australian Aborigines. There's really not been a whole lot of work, and that's interesting because it seems to me that you can have what appears to be the same kind of phenomena and it be interpreted in very different ways. The cultural context is important to understand the phenomenon. For instance, the island of Palau in the Pacific, there is mediumship, and mediumship is done in a traditional sort of way where there is a god who is consulted. But it turns out that the medium has an appointment in the civic government. And sort of the function of that medium is to support the government. And one can well imagine then when the government becomes entangled in the religion, how interesting that becomes. We might think of the United States today, but it seems to me that there's growing importance of cross-cultural issues and normal psychology. When you look, there is indigenous psychologies, cross-cultural psychologies. There are 4 or 5 different methodologies, people who are pursuing the issues, and although most of them think in some sort of way in the distant future we might be able to have a kind of universal psychology, nevertheless there is growing understanding that until we understand psychologies in their cultural context, we really won't understand psychology. And lo and behold, you know, we just may learn something if we study other cultures. We may learn about other phenomena. We may understand how these techniques are produced. There are all sorts of things that we might be able to learn. My work has taken place in Bali, particularly over the last 14 or 15 years mainly. And this is just to give a context to see where Bali is. Down here is Australia. Up here, this is Sumatra, and up here is Aceh, where the tsunami started. Bali is this little island right here to the east of Java. And about the only time that Java has been nice to Bali is that it protected Bali from the tsunami, and they had no ill effects. Bali, this is an island. It's 172 miles wide, 102 miles from north to south, 8 degrees below the equator. Population is a little over 3 million people. Before going on to some others, this is pretty much where wet rice farming is. It's a volcanic country. There are active volcanoes, particularly up here. This is what's called Gunung Agung, and this is going to be important. Agung is large. Gunung is mountain, the large mountain. It's the height that is also the most sacred spot, so keep that in mind. Bali is literally an island in a sea of other islands in Indonesia that almost all are virtually Muslim. And so it is unique, and the religion is unique, and you really need to understand Balinese religion to understand Balinese, anything in Bali, but Balinese culture. It's called the Isle of the Gods because it's important, but Balinese religion is derivative from a Hinduism coming over from Java in the late 15th century. So it is not, it is in some way traditional Hindu, but it's very different. They themselves call it Bali Hinduism to distinguish itself from Hinduism in India, for instance. It came over from Java. It connected with indigenous animism, as well as indigenous ancestor worship, and there are important elements of the ancestors that are there. I might also mention that there's some Tantric Buddhism involved, and there's what's called a dat, or local custom, which is important. So if you want to understand Bali religion, Bali Hinduism, as a whole, it's awfully difficult to do because you can go to a particular location and understand everything that's going on, but at the same time realize in a village 5 miles down the way, it may be different because of a dat, local custom. What are the key ideas in Bali Hinduism? And these seem to permeate most of the island. Well, first and foremost is the idea of the 3 worlds of Bali. To the Balinese, there are the 3 worlds: the upper world, the world of generative forces, the world of divinities. On the other hand, there's the lower world, the degenerative forces, the demonic forces. And there is a 3rd world, the world of the seen, the physical world, which actually exists because the upper world and the lower world are kept in balance. So the notion of balance becomes absolutely central in Bali, not only religiously, psychologically, in dance. Those of you who saw the clip on the dance last night, ethically, the notion of balance is important, and it's going to be important in healing, as we see. Now, they map that onto the environment. Remember I talked about Gunung Agung, the highest mountain. Well, that to them is representative of the upper world, okay? So that it is the height. And so you go down to the other end, and that is the sea, and that is the end toward the demonic. Now what's interesting is that Bali is one of the few islands that I know of that is not oriented to the sea. And is not oriented to the sea simply because of their particular worldview. And in between, there is the physical world. But this defines what is sacred and what is secular, if you will. And it is mapped throughout the island and on everything, so that you have the whole island set up that way. In the same way, you have a village set up that way, so that there are essentially 3 temples. And the temple that is the most sacred temple is in the northeast, that is oriented toward Gunung Agung, and the temple of the dead is oriented toward the sea or the south. So northeast is the most sacred, southeast is the west. And no matter where you are, you can orient yourself going down a street in Bali, because each family compound has a family temple. And the family temple is always oriented toward Gunung Agung. So actually, even if you're in the north, they call that even if you're in North Bali, they'll call it north, although geographically we would call it south. It continues to be mapped onto the compound, the family compound, even down to a description of architecture, whereas this is the most holy, and you have the center part here, and you have the third part here, which is called the feet. And this sort of describes the human being is this way. This is, for instance, why you never put your head on a child in Bali, because that is the most sacred part. It's when offerings are being offered to the gods, they will tend to carry them on their heads. The second idea is Buana Agung, or microcosm, and Buana Alit, of microcosm. And I'm working toward what the anthropologists might call a sort of magical worldview, an infused and intermingled worldview where they think the microcosm is mirrored in the microcosm, the inward, and vice versa. An example of this is, it's really not related to rice, but this is just to show the rice growing, but also it's a volcanic island and there are hills. My family was, a number of years ago, was climbing out of a ravine, and my daughter slipped and skinned her knee, and it was bloody, and so we came up and we wanted to have it fixed. And the Balinese, of course, did that, but what they were continually concerned about was not what had happened to her physically, but the fact that she had lost her balance and fell indicated that internally, in the microscopic level, she was out of balance, and something spiritual needed to be rectified. And at this particular time in 1990, that was true. Kanda Umpat, the 4 siblings. The Balinese believe that every child, and it comes with the fetus, every child is born with 4 internal siblings. If you're male, they're male. If you're female, it is female. And how you take care of them is important throughout your life, so that when they sit down, they will take a bit of food and shove it to the side or drop it on the ground in order to show their respect. A lot of illness is due to the fact that one has not paid attention to the 4 siblings. And in that sense, you are going to be out of balance. Now, mediums are known as healers. And the general term for healer is Balian. And there are at least 12 kinds of Balian. They're specialists. You know, it's like your internist, it's, you know, your ear, nose, throat. It's that sort of thing. They are specialists. And I've just listed them here. Some are massage, some set bones, some halt rain, and so forth. And spirit mediums are up here. They are Balian Taksu. Taksu is the name for spirit. Now, it is not used only for mediums, but everybody who has a talent also has a taksu. So if there is a particularly good dancer, that person displays taksu. That person displays spirit. But the notion and connection of being close to the spirit is incorporated in their term of Balian taksu. They have another name essentially with Balian of being possessed also. They typically go into trance because they are known as Balians, as healers. Their job is to treat illness. Their job is to heal, but in an interesting sort of way, because in fact they are mediums. Okay, trance is ubiquitous, and these are just are two cases that I've seen rather recently of trance in Bali. One is in a mountain, a particular ceremony up in the mountains where a number of people actually were entranced, and here are the people, I think one of them may be a priest, who is trying to bring her out of, she is possessed, and bring her out of the trance possession. This is a kind of ceremony that takes place actually near Denpasar, the capital, and I've seen it several times. It happens annually, and annually is 210 days according to the Balinese calendar. It's sort of regional, and temples from the various areas will bring people, and some of the people will spontaneously go, will be possessed, and they come out of the inner temple, they go to the middle temple, they go around a building that's used for the cockfighting, and by the way, there's always cockfighting before this, and the reason for that is it is the spilling of blood. It is the offering. It is legitimate. Now the Balinese take advantage of that, and they bet, and they have cockfights and other non-religious ceremonies, but they are officially allowed to have cockfights because of the religious importance. But they come out, and I don't know if you can see it, they walk around, and periodically they will reach for what's called the kris, the knife here, and they self-stab or go through the motions of that. They are not hurt. And I guess one of the important is, why is trance ubiquitous? Well, kids are at all of these ceremonies and they see it. It becomes natural and normal and is part of their worldview. They go to the Wayang ceremonies that I'll mention earlier. It is a normal part of religious life to see people in possession. There are three causes of illness in Bali. The first is karma. They are Hindu. And karma cannot be treated. I mean, it is a religious imperative, and in fact, there are things that you can do to somewhat mediate the influence, but as a matter of fact, this is something that is your due. Black magic. Black magic is ubiquitous in Bali also. And it's hard to go through several families without hearing stories about someone being attacked with black magic or even being killed with black magic. Well, I could tell stories about that, but I won't. But what it does mean is that healers and other forms of healers also tend to try to understand black magic. And there are ways to do that, and I can talk about that later. So everybody understands black magic. It's just that the white magicians try to use their influence to mitigate the black magic. And then finally, there is, and most importantly, imbalance. If you ask for why they go to these ceremonies, 49% of the people go, and this is from Linda Connor, 49% of the people go because of illness in a family. 18% in her survey go because of a death, and they're trying to figure out what to do with the cremation and the right kinds of offerings. 10% go because of some sort of strife in the household. 4% because they want to try to identify the ancestor that has been reincarnated in a child, although there is in fact another Balian who specializes in that. And then 10% for other reasons. So there's a variety of reasons. But in my own experience and others who have studied mediumship a lot, the foremost recommendation of people, of what they should do no matter why they come, is to give offerings. Why is that? Because balance is fundamental. And what you constantly have to do is to offer offerings to the gods and to the demons. In the family compound that I stay in, there are between 100 and 200 offerings made daily, small ones. Traditionally in Bali, women spent 30% of their waking hours creating offerings to make. So the notion of offerings is important, and it is the offerings that in general bring people, bring situations, bring the world back into balance. Mediumistic sessions, you saw, if you were here last night, a little bit of a typical one. It's a family affair. Usually 6 or 8 or 10 people go. You don't make appointments. You go in. Unless you go very early, there are already 2 or 3 other family groups that are there. You sit around. These are very public. You hear everything that the medium has to say to that family, and the people after you hear everything the medium says to you. There are ceremonial aspects. They wear their ritual, their temple ritual when they go. They bring offerings. The setting is in a particular, what they call Bali, a building which is particular for ceremonial occasions. And I'll come back to this. The language that is used at mediumistic sessions is a whole host of languages. They can use Indonesian, they often use Balinese, but they also at times use Kawi. Kawi is a kind of cross between Sanskrit and Old Javanese. And as I'm going to talk about later, the Balinese have a particular view of language that as you go through these languages, they get more and more sacred, just as the higher you go, the more and more sacred the territory is. And so the use of these languages indicate to varying degrees the sacredness that is appropriate. Now, the informational aspect of communication is present. This is an aspect of Balinese mediumship. If they're having a problem, the medium is going to say, well, what you need to do is you need to make this offering and that offering and that offering. If they go and sometimes there is illness, they may say the cause of it, they may indicate where the black magic came from. All of that is important. So the informational aspect is present, and I don't want to denigrate that. My point is going to be that is, if we stop there in Balinese mediumship, we will not completely understand the phenomenon. And this is where, I'm sorry, my background is philosophy, this is where I'm going to turn theoretical, and sort of hang on there, if you will. Philosophically, actually beginning all the way back with Plato, but certainly with the beginning of dualism in the 17th century, the philosopher Richard Rorty argued that mind was invented in the 17th century. And what he was talking about, of course, was the modern mind, a particular view of mind. And that view of mind that he had occurred out of a dualistic separation between mind and body. And what was interesting about it was that he explained perception as according to what's called copy dualism. That what perception was was a kind of taking a picture of the world and that picture coming up on the internal screen. This is where I think our continuing interest, and we talk about it in psychology today, about the importance of representation. It comes from this 17th century notion, and representation literally means a kind of representation. And whenever I think anybody uses that notion, whether or not they know it or not, they are still within this dualistic context. And I put this over here because that's essentially what the mind wanted to do. Actually, Plato used the analogy of what the mind does. It takes a shiny object, okay, or we would say it mirrors, or it takes a picture. It represents the world. Now, if that's your view of what perception is, and this is basically the view of perception and understanding of the mind since the 17th century, and we've had iterations of it, what you are primarily interested in is whether or not you have an accurate representation. Whether or not that internal image mirrors or matches or copies the external world. Now, what I want to suggest is that although I have serious problems with this particular view of perception, it's nevertheless a powerful view. But when you think about our interest in mediums and whether or not they give accurate information, and we do these tests, which I have done myself, what we are trying to do is to see whether or not they are representing or representing the world. It is part and parcel of this Western worldview. Now, obviously, there's something important and powerful about the Western worldview because we seem to be taking over. But unless we are sensitive to other views of the world. And this is why it's important, I think, that psychology is moving in the direction of trying to understand indigenous psychologies and other ways of looking to the world. We may think that this is the only way to understand the world. And what I'm suggesting, just using Balinese mediumship, is that we ought to take different approaches. Okay, well, I come back to the notion of healing and balance. This is, well, these are two pictures. This is obviously, they are taking these offerings to be offered to the gods because they are sitting on the heads. This is actually a 3-month ceremony. This is the first time this baby has been allowed to put its feet on the ground. Because when it has come into the earth, the world, it has come in through reincarnation and is still so close to the divine. And the downward is the demonic, is the negative forces that they won't allow the baby to touch the ground. Now, I think this probably has a lot to do, child-rearing practices, and if you've been to Bali and see the Balinese, I think there are interesting psychological consequences to that. But this is, they're going to be, in here is a chicken that they're going to be sacrificing. Okay, now the point is, and I want to use this term magical Bali in the two different senses. It's a magical place, we say, It's just a wonderful, wonderful place. And yet I want to use it in a more theoretical sense of a magical worldview, but anthropologically there are problems with that and a lot of discussion, so I don't want to push that too far. But the notion is there is a tremendous intermingling between what we might call the visible and the invisible world, what the Balinese call Sekala and Niskala. I've already mentioned the microcosm and the macrocosm. That is, one is simply, should I say, a mirror of the other. They are intertwined, and when something happens on one level, it is manifested in the other. And the causal direction goes both ways. It's not simply one way. The notion of the three worlds, the very notion that the visible world is a product of the invisible world, that unless the upper world and the lower world are held in balance, we won't even exist. And I'll mention a ceremony, and it happens every 100 years in Bali, Ekadasa Rudra, where they literally, ceremonially, break apart the constituents of the world, according to their view, and Siwa brings them back together in balance. Okay? Kanda Umpat. Everybody's a medium in a sense. Or everybody, put it another way, everybody is possessed in Bali. Everybody has these spirits, and the only question is whether or not one recognizes these spirits or doesn't recognize those spirits. The taksu that I mentioned before, they're called Balian taksu. The taksu is an indwelling spirit. And anybody who is able to perform well carries a special spirit with them. And then the Balinese talk about Sakti, which is spiritual power. And this is manifested in the visible world in a number of ways. I hate to even mention this, but one of the people I work with speak knowingly, and he's promised me to take me to this, but I have not been, of a competition, and the Balinese are great competitors, but a competition, he says, to the death of people fighting each other with their Sakti, or power. If you're around Bali and you continually hear these stories, you really begin to get into another kind of world. Okay, again, turning theoretical again. What's important for science is that our words are precise. They have one meaning. What's important for logic, we call it the problem of the excluded middle. If you have a term here that is ambiguous, okay, what we want to do is to have a word that has a precise meaning. The Balinese believe in polysemy. That is, the richer the concept, the more the implication, the greater the meanings, the better the word. And I think perhaps I begin to foreshadow this notion of creativity that Michael may want to talk about, and that's why we talked about this monotheism and polytheism. After all, if the world, if reality is so complex that there is no one way of understanding it, what is most important is to understand it from a lot of different perspectives. It is multiplicity that is important. It is not clarity, if you will. Okay? The Balinese do not have a traditional distinction between truth and fiction. Now, this is not to say that they can't get around that lack of linguistic distinction. But I think it's really important that, again, truth and fiction, the importance of that theoretically may very well hang on this notion of representation that we talked about earlier. There are utterances in English which are called performative utterances. I can, for instance, say, there's water in the pitcher. And what I invite you to do is, that is a map, a mirror, a description of something in the world. I can also say, if I had the right credentials, I thee wed. That is, I'm not describing anything, but the very utterance brings it about. And philosophers call this performative. Well, if you go to other points of view, what you notice is that the idea that Sanskrit has power, and the utterance of that, saying it exactly right, and the Balinese in their mantras are absolutely clear about this. You've got to say the mantra right, because when you say it right, it has Sakti. It has power. And the saying of the right word in the right way itself is powerful, just like religious objects have Sakti and have power. And Kawi is a language that has power. Okay, mediumship, in the 2 minutes I have left, mediumship, it seems to me, is polysemy. Okay? There are various levels to it, and it's precisely because of those levels that it's so interesting and important for the Balinese and for us. There is a representational aspect to it, but there are other levels to it also. You see it in the Wayang, the shadow puppet. And what happens is you have the shadow puppets going on, and on one hand it's sort of entertainment, and yet on the other hand it is a kind of literal recreation of those Ramayana stories. I've already mentioned Ekadasa Rudra, where they have this ceremony where they literally bring together the upper and the lower world in recreating it and bringing about balance. I guess what I want to say is the bottom line is that mediumship in Bali can also be an instance of that instantiation of balance. It's not simply giving information, but with the intermingling of the spiritual, of the religious, of Niskala and Sekala, a balance is created that brings about healing. Mediumship is a phenomenon in Bali that not only gives information, it helps recreate and make whole the world. Thank you.
Dr. Michael Grasso.
I feel as though I could write a commentary on your paper. It's so rich, full of ideas. I want to make one comment and then ask you a question. The comment is about your discussion of polysemy, and that's a very interesting point. If we were, in fact, to use language polysemously all the time, we would inhabit a more of a poetic, emotional universe. Whereas we in the West, who are experts in defining terms and nailing them down and using them operationally, excel, in terms of our general lifestyle, in the world of science, in the world of technology, in the world of control of nature, and so on and so forth, including the production of military technologies and all the things that define our fate as a Western culture, for better or for worse. But I do like that stress on the value of polysemy, because that would be one way of, as it were, toning all of that latter part down and trying to work our way up or down, as it were, or across into a more poetic worldview. And I don't mean that in the sense of versifying or pretty language, but in the sense of rich, resonant levels of meaning that you clearly evoke. Now, my question is sort of related to my comment, and I want to just give you an opportunity to expatiate a bit, if you feel like it, on how you think we could, in our own personal lives, I'm not asking for a messianic formula for the transformation of life on earth, but a little humble, everyday suggestion of how we can all perhaps learn how to live a more magical worldview in the light of what you've learned about Balinese mediumship. In other words, the practical implications of this, that's my particular obsession, but go ahead. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I was telling some people over lunch that the first time that I spent significant time in Bali, and I heard these stories and I worked very closely culturally. I was constantly going to ceremonies and so forth. I came away with a different worldview, and it lasted a little bit. I was on sabbatical in Australia at the time, and it lasted a while. But I got back to Australia, kind of Western, and it began to fade away. How do you do it? I don't know. Travel to Bali. experience the sorts of things that we are talking about today, engage in meditation. I think probably the audience probably has better ideas than I do on this. But those sorts of things. Try something new. You've begun painting. Try something new.
Dr. Koss.
I can't resist but adding to that. I do think that living in other cultural worlds, for instance, having several languages instead of being unilingual, these things are really passports to another worldview and to other ways of thinking about it. But there's also another and somewhat opposite thing, I think, is the sense of the unity of all things in our universe. And the relating to one thing and knowing that it spiders out to everything else. Because people, but not only people, but the environment, the natural environment, what's left of it, and so forth, is sort of being there in that wholeness is, and many religions, Buddhism is one of them, that really points the way to doing that.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true, that environmentalism in some way has been ahead of a lot of other disciplines in bringing this systemic notion of connectedness to the fore. And certainly environmental sensitivity helps in that, yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Gardania.
Thanks, very interesting. I had a couple of questions. The first one you mentioned just in passing, and I assume it had to do with psychological, perhaps even negative aspects of this distinction between the upper and the down, and thinking that a part of the body is lower. Or at least you mentioned some psychological outcomes of that. So that's one question. The other one is, I know some people have said, well, the ritual of Baron and Rangda and so on, of balance, because it became very famous, because of Bateson and so on, that it has become touristy in some areas. Now, I assume that that distinction is a Western distinction, or maybe not. Your question is, do they make some distinction of, are some ceremonies more authentic, or whatever concept they may use, more authentic than others, or not?
To answer the latter question first, yes, they do. But not, interestingly enough, and I have to admit, I've not wrapped my mind around this, because if you are so polysemic, you can make statements that seem to be contradictory to Western philosophers. For instance, they say that the demonic is from God. And they're very serious about that, and I've had people sort of explain it to me, and every time it explains to me, there's a part of me that it just goes out of. But yes, particularly at Batu Balan and other places in Bali where you go and see the Rangda and Barong dance. And yet they also insist that there is an element, they will always give an offering beforehand. And although the trance in that is not convincing, and one has a hard time thinking that at 10 o'clock every morning you're going to be able to do that, they still take it as not simply tourist. But at the same time, even among religious ceremonies, there are some that are deeper, more important than other ceremonies. And the aspects, I think I was referring to the aspects of the up and down. Margaret Mead produced a photographic essay, and in it she argued that child rearing was important, and she gave a particular theory. Suriani and Jensen, the American psychiatrist, have written a book refuting that. I actually don't think they understood everything that Bateson was saying there. But when you go, one of the things you notice is children just don't seem to cry much. They are not like our kids. Just very, very different. And so I wasn't mean, I think there might be some negative, but what I was thinking, I was pointing to, that there are differences here, there are psychological differences, and it turns out to be, I think it probably has something to do, very important, the fact that then they have to carry them all the time, and this may be one reason why, and since they are so much closer to the gods, they sort of cater to every whim, and this is going to have a psychological effect on it, on them, both positively and negatively. Thanks.
Dr. Robert Van de Kessel.
Just a general comment, since there's been so much emphasis here on anthropology and parapsychology, possible reference people might want to check out is in the Handbook of Parapsychology. I had one time tried to do a systematic review of everything that was available in parapsychology and anthropology, trying to talk about the importance of the relevance of context. Recently I've been trying to think about doing some work with identical twins in telepathy. So I tried to review the literature, came across a couple of articles in which they were going to try and test out, do identical twins have telepathy? So they took an identical twin, had an experimenter do an ESP test with them. The identical twin did not do very well, and concluded that there was no evidence for identical twins having telepathic ability, not recognizing that nobody ever said an identical twin in isolation had it. It's identical twin A with identical twin B. But unless you're looking at the context, you would totally lose it. Again, trying to put an anthropological twist on this, you had referred to some of the work I had done down in the Sandbox Islands. What I was trying to do is to do some ESP testing with culturally relevant stimuli like jaguars and sharks and so forth instead of stars and circles, and found I got some reasonable results doing the testing. When I got through this work, let me acknowledge the Parapsychology Foundation having sponsored this, that one of the times when I was leaving, the last time unfortunately that I left, one of the kids came up to me and he said, but you're a Yagwa, you're just not one of us. So why should it be, if I'm the one looking at the cards and I'm trying to send this to one of the Kuna recipients, why is that going to go? They said, because you're not in our culture. You're white, you're Yagwa, and so let's do it amongst ourselves. Well, I hadn't really planned for that. I was leaving the next day, but I very quickly did it, where I now had a Kuna Indian as the sender and a Kuna Indian as the recipient. Because like Rose, which you referred to earlier, was again just a white guy doing it with the Australian Aborigines. And so when I did it with these Kuna Indians to Kuna Indians, they got such exceptionally high scores. I thought there had to be something wrong with it, but I hadn't planned for it. I didn't really have the controls in it. I had to leave the next day. And so it still is left undone in parapsychology if you're really going to try and test out telepathy, which isn't on the topic of mediumship. But if you want to try and test out paranormal abilities, then it makes much more sense to have a member of that culture doing it with another member of that culture rather than the white guy with the Buana hat going in and trying to do it.
Absolutely. Over lunch, Joe and I had a discussion. My last 4 or 5 years in Bali, I've been taking the D-Mills paradigm to Bali, and in fact I've been very successful, and it is between Balinese, but ever mindful of this context. I still don't think it is culturally sensitive enough, and this is when I was trying to have a discussion with Joan, who's been to Bali, trying to figure out how we could take this kind of paradigm and make it more culturally sensitive. So you're absolutely right.
Dr. Alvarado?
You mentioned many interesting things about the functions of the Balinese mediums, in their own context. I was just wondering if you think that American, European mediumship may be analyzed, in the same way, and you may see that there are similar functions of the construction of the world and maintaining our, self-identity and similar concepts on your paper, but just right here in our own backyard.
It's an interesting idea. I've not thought about it, but I would. The anthropologists now are going to American garbage dumps and checking them out. Yeah, why not? Why not go to American culture and do this?
Dr. Soto?
I ask myself if you've had the opportunity to observe any medium, of any Balinese medium share with you in a different context, out of the island, in a different culture, that is a more parallel, I think it is, than
Okay, where, if I have talked to a Balinese medium outside of Bali?
yes.
Yeah. I've talked to Balinese outside of Bali, and Dr. Siriani has a background as a healer, but that's probably as close to talking to a medium outside of the island. Balinese do not travel much and don't have much money to bring them. Yeah, I'm sorry. By the way, one interesting thing about that I didn't mention is about Balinese mediumship. They are, in a sense, they are sort of as skeptical about information that is given as we are. They do a kind of majority vote technique. They will typically go to 2 or 3 mediums to see whether or not they give the same information before they act on the information. So they have absolutely no doubt in the spirit world. They have absolutely no doubt in possession. It's just they're hedging their bets.
Hi there, my name is Lisette Coley and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. I want to welcome you to the Foundation's YouTube channel. There's already a wealth of information available posted, and we have plans to continue to post our classic lectures and new materials, so you don't want to miss out. So hit that bell, please subscribe, and you'll be notified. And hope you enjoy.